Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of distillationsbl. And today we are going to be continuing from Otto Rank's Truth and Reality. And we started last episode and we're going to dive a bit deeper today. So let's do it. Quote, "In the religious myths, the creative will appears personified in God, and man already feels himself guilty when he assumes himself to be like God, that is, ascribes this will to himself." So we're starting with the religious myths, as distinct from, I think, the more classic heroes myth. And so when there's a religious bent to it, the creative will that I would say we all possess appears personified in God. So the religious minded ascribe this creativity, this inherent creative will that we have, and it's a God thing. It's personified in God. And when you're in that framework, man already feels himself guilty because it's a God thing that you're enacting. And if you're enacting something that is personified in God, you're assuming yourself to be like God or to be using God's powers for your own ends, something like that. And yeah, ascribes this will to himself. So it's almost like, hey, am I supposed to be doing this? This is a godly thing. This is a divine thing. This is a spiritual gift that I possess, given to me, you, whoever, by God. And I'm sort of warping it into my own self-will and filtering it through the lens of my own self. And so that brings up lots of feelings of guilt, because it's like, I shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be doing this. In the heroic myths, on the contrary, man appears as himself, creative, and guilt for his suffering and fall is ascribed to God, that is, to his own will. Okay, so this is a little confusing. So now we've got the heroic myths. We were talking about the religious myths. Now we have the hero's journey, like I said, the monomyth, Joseph Campbell. And man appears as himself creative and guilt for... So here the hero is himself creative. It's not that it's a God thing that the hero is latching onto or warping or using for his own ends, but man just naturally is creative. And the guilt that comes up for his suffering and fall is ascribed to God, that is, to his own will. So I think this is saying that the guilt, then you have this natural capacity, and it's not God's capacity. It's like, hey, I've got this capacity for will and creativity to create something new. And all the guilt feelings and the suffering that comes along with it, it's my own will, it's the hero's own will, but the suffering and fall that results from the attempt to enact that will into the world is ascribed to God. Sort of like God has set me up to suffer and fall when trying to use my own will. I think that's what's going on here. Let's keep going because it might make this distinction a bit clearer. Quote, "Both are only extreme reaction phenomena of man wavering between his godlikeness and his nothingness, whose will is awakened to knowledge of its power and whose consciousness is aroused to terror before it." So both of these situations, the religious myths on the one hand, where the creative will is a God attribute that you're using. And the heroic myths, on the other hand, where it's your own capacity for creative will that's not a God capacity, it's a human capacity, but the fall and suffering is ascribed to God. You know, you maybe gave me these qualities for creative acts of will, and now I've been suffering and fallen, and it's your fault, God. So we've got these two myths, religious and heroic, and both of these are extreme reaction phenomena. So these are just two ways that you can react to what we have here, which is wavering between two qualities that humans possess, which is godlikeness on the one hand and nothingness. So godlikeness, when the creative will is an aspect of God that you are using, and nothingness when I have this creative capacity for creative will within myself, but I have been beaten down to nothingness, whose will is awakened to knowledge of its power, and whose consciousness is aroused to terror before it. So you've got this reaction of wavering between these two extremes of characteristics of being a human being. And in this wavering, using the creative will, you're awakened to knowing that this is this powerful thing that I'm playing with. And your consciousness, your self-consciousness, or your consciousness of the power of the thing you're playing around with is aroused to terror before it. I think you're terroring because on the one hand, it's like you're using this thing that's supposed to be divine or spiritual, and you're using it for your own ends, or you're trying not to, but it's, you know, am I abusing this thing that is spiritual and divine and godlike? Or you just kind of go for it and you're like, I've got this capacity. I was born an artist. I was born a creative, a musician, say, or a painter or something. I was born and I have this creative capacity. I'm just going to share it with the world. I'm going to put all my stuff out there. And then you get beaten down into nothingness, fallenness, suffering because of events outside of your control, or probably more so as a result of your using your creative will in such a ambitious way. And both of these two uses of creative will are terrifying because it's one extreme or the other. You're playing with fire. It's fire in this one sense, or it's fire in this other sense. There's no escaping the power and terror before whatever it is that's going on. Whatever it is that's going on in this use of creative will, it's powerful and terrifying at the same time. And again, like I said last time, you're pinballing between these two possibilities. So now we're back to the heroic myth. The heroic myth strives to justify this creative will through glorifying its deeds, while religion reminds man that he himself is but a creature dependent on cosmic forces. So I think this is helping to concretize what's going on here. So the heroic myth, where the hero is given the gift of creative will through human means alone, that myth justifies this gift by glorifying its deeds, the results probably, and the deeds themselves. So here's this hero, he's going on a journey and he's slaying the dragon and all that stuff. And isn't that incredible? Isn't that laudable? Isn't that heroic? The deeds that are being done. And so the justification is sort of, this is good because look at what it's done and look at what the deeds are. And we're not saying that they're divine or spiritual or godlike. we're saying this is just a human, a hero, who is using this capacity for creative will. And the justification is look at what it's wrought, look at what the deeds are, look at what the results are. But now we go back to the religious myth. The religious myth, religion reminds man that he himself is but a creature dependent on cosmic forces. A religious myth is probably more emphasizing circumstances and things outside of your control. You're nothing compared to God, and in the religious myth here, and you're dependent on these larger than you cosmic forces. Quote, so the creative will automatically brings the guilt reaction with it. No matter what you do, you're hitting one of those two extremes. You're wavering between godlikeness and nothingness, and you're going to have this guilt reaction to it. Quote, as the self-reducing depression follows the manic elation. So when you're caught up in using this creative will, when you're just all in it and you're acting and doing the actions, you're in a manic elation. But what follows that is a self-reducing depression of questioning, now being super aware of these two extremes and questioning whether or not using the creative will was the right thing or not. In one sense or the other, you just can't escape the conundrum there. And so there's a self-reducing depression that follows. You know, you put it out there and then you're like, oh, Jesus Christ, you know, was I supposed to use something godlike? Or why am I suffering now? Why do I feel guilty after using my own human capacity for creative will? Quote, in a word, will and guilt are the two complementary sides of one and the same phenomenon, which Schopenhauer, rested on the Hindu teachings, has perceived and comprehended most deeply of all moderns. Okay, we've got a reason to read some Schopenhauer, but this is picking up on that idea where these two things are connected. They're two faces of the same, two sides of the same coin, of the same phenomenon. So the same phenomenon is manifesting or expressing itself in these two different ways, depending on whether you interpret it religiously or heroically. Quote, a philosophy of will, accordingly, must either be deeply pessimistic if it emphasizes the guilt side, or extremely optimistic, like Nietzsche, if it affirms the creative power. And I think that makes sense. A philosophy of will, it's going to have to, if it takes the religious side, then it's going to emphasize the guilt feelings of misusing or using something of divine origin, or it's going to go completely opposite and extremely optimistic, like Nietzsche's Overman, Übermensch, where it's affirming the creative power and look at what humans can do and create our own values in the wake of the death of God and all of that. I'm no expert here, so I'm just referencing that in passing because I should read some more Nietzsche. All right, so this one was a little more challenging. I feel like there was this dichotomy that was set up, and I can't quite track if I would have preferred almost like a table where the religious myths are on one side and the heroic myths are on the other, and these different qualities or features kind of line up for each one, because as the text goes on, I'm starting to lose the plot of, you know, is the guilty feeling only ascribed to the religious myths and godlikeness and ascertaining a godlike power and using it for our own ends? Is that sort of what's going on? And then, you know, nothingness, is that ascribed to the heroic myths? And yeah, I mean, this part, in the heroic myths, on the contrary, man appears as himself creative. Okay, I get that. And guilt for his suffering and fall is ascribed to God, that is, to his own will. Well, is it ascribed to God or is it ascribed to his own will? I thought that God and your will being one was the religious myth, because then you feel guilty for those two things being one and the same. And that the heroic myth was just, this is of our own human power. And then the suffering and fall would then be blamed on yourself, on your humanness, your fallenness, maybe something like that. But maybe in the extreme, you then blame God. But I think you could probably be an atheist who's using his creative, and I think Nietzsche, after God here, after the death of God, wouldn't that be assumed that it would be an atheist? And then why is the suffering and fall being ascribed to God? And where does the suffering and fall come from in this human-powered creative will? Okay, I hope that tracks. I mean, maybe I should, if I had one of those things where I could, draw things out and you could see it, maybe I should have sketched something out and put it up on the screen. But there's a lot of good stuff here. I would like a little more clarity. I really want to avoid it, but maybe I'll throw it into ChatGPT and do an update video. But there is a lot of good stuff. Like, I very much understand this wavering between godlikeness and nothingness. And then, having this self-awareness or this awareness of the power of creativity and putting new things, brand new things into the world, and having terror before this creative will that oftentimes people say all the time is, when insight strikes or you do something very genuinely creative, it doesn't feel like you are doing it. It feels as if you are receiving it or in the flow state, and things are just kind of lining up and happening. And there's something very kind of ego deflating about that process. And so when you're in that process and then, you don't know what the results of you enacting this thing, this power, I think I could see that being terrifying. I think I'm a bit terrified of it. And it connects to the previous set of quotes that we did where, the guilt feeling comes from not knowing the consequences of the act. And so that's a conundrum for the hero. All right, so this one maybe wasn't as great because there was a bit more uncertainty and a bit more confusion about the thread throughout here, but I'm trying to engage with this in a critical manner. I'm saying what I'm thinking, so I could have powered through that and then just painted over what I felt like were inconsistencies or the inability to track what was going where. But I'm trying to understand what is being said, and you can only do that through this kind of engagement. It's a dense book. It is a really dense book, and the language can be very, very dense. And I'm no expert in mythology or psychology, so I'm coming at this with a pretty naive perspective. So you'll have to bear with me. And like I said, maybe I'll end up throwing it into an AI, and the AI can read the whole book and then give some direction as to what was being said. Can't trust that completely, but usually is pretty damn helpful. All right, so I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. If you're with me this far, like, comment, subscribe, share with anyone else you think might resonate or be into this kind of thing. And yeah, thank you for being here, and I'll see you on the next one.